Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of WCNC Charlotte Stream. This is going to be flowing similar to what happened with Helene, as we're getting a lot of brand new information in right now. But literally just minutes ago, we got confirmation that Milton had made landfall as a Category 3 major hurricane, 120 miles per hour near Siesta Key. Now, right now, what we know about the storm, of course, is it's continuing to produce significant storm surge as the storm continues to make landfall here. Now, we have gotten some reports in the Tampa Bay area of reverse storm surge. What happens is when storms, onshore winds shove water inland, depending on where the exact storm makes landfall, sometimes that storm can get what's called reverse storm surge. Think about the counterclockwise rotation, right? So if it makes landfall in Sarasota, that means areas south get more of that water and maybe areas north get less. But eventually, once the storm continues to push northeast, that will not necessarily last forever for folks in Tampa Bay, because it's not an eastward moving storm, it's a northeastward moving storm. So I'm going to draw on here a little bit to show you what I mean. Okay, so here's the current satellite loop. I'm going to zoom in here so we can see exactly where the storm made landfall. If you're familiar with this area at all, I've actually lived in Fort Myers and Sarasota as well. Tampa Bay is here. So Sarasota County is here. Then you get down toward Lee County, Charlotte County, and Collier County. Sarasota is a little bit further inland, closer to I-75, that is, but Siesta Key is right near the immediate coast. It's a little barrier island there just south of Longboat Key. You can see it here. It is right near the immediate coast. It is a quaint, cute little island that has been there forever. I don't believe in near modern history has ever seen a direct landfall. So again, Siesta Key is where the storm made landfall. We got confirmation just a few minutes ago from the National Hurricane Center. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about storm surge. So if this is the center of Milton, I'm going to put it on now. That means that it will stay in the same place, so we can kind of draw this on for you. What will happen is the storm surge, the worst surge, comes in like this, because again, the storm is rotating counterclockwise. It is a cyclone. That's what happens with low pressure. But then you go on the northern side of this storm, and you can get what's called reverse storm surge this way. But what eventually will happen as the storm moves further inland, because it is moving northeast, that reverse storm surge will eventually come back and actually produce additional surge on that other side. Now, another thing I want to point out here, because I know when we talk about big storms like this, it's easy to see something on social media, online, and whether it's good or bad, kind of allow for it to overtake our emotions, right? Especially after Helene has really impacted a lot of these areas here locally, all the way toward the mountains, western North Carolina. People get storm anxiety, and I absolutely understand. I'm one of those people. My family, of course, still in Florida in some of these parts. But what's important to note here is just because the center didn't make actual landfall near Tampa Bay, what Tampa is dealing with right now is the northern eye wall of Milton. What that means is if the center is the eye and it moves in, that means someone has the northern eye wall and someone eventually gets the southern eye wall. So if you see all of these areas really, really deep red shading for St. Pete down toward just north of Bradenton, of course, all of this is the Tampa Bay area. If you're not familiar with this area, all of this is Tampa Bay. So what they're getting right now is the northern eye wall. So St. Pete, Clearwater, Tampa, all the way inland actually toward Lakeland. And that is the highest winds that most storms will see. And also the really, really strong wind gusts, because of all this rain that they've had as of late, will continue to produce not just high winds, but also really high risk of power outages. Think back to Helene here in North Carolina, how we talked about the predecessor rain event, how it saturated the ground, how that meant that stronger winds would continue to allow for those scattered power outages. They're going to see a similar song and dance here over the next few days. So I'm going to zoom out once again so you can see the movement here of Helene. Again, it is going to continue to move inland, but I think the million-dollar question now will be who is going to continue to see the worst impacts. So here's the latest track from the National Hurricane Center. Again, we don't oftentimes look at the track, right, to talk about impacts, but where I want to show y'all is two things. One, these areas in the path of Helene, you can see Orlando, Melbourne, over toward parts of the Villages, Lakeland. These areas don't often see impacts from this strong of a storm. It made landfall as a Category 3. Yes, we've seen Category 3s, we've seen 4s, we've seen 5s make landfall in the state of Florida. But because Helene is moving so fast, this storm is going to be racing across the state. Right now, the current trajectory has 2 a.m. a 90-mile-per-hour Category 1 hurricane. I think there's a pretty good chance it could still be a Category 2 at that point, because Milton has already exceeded our expectations in the sense of not just strength overall, because it was always expected to be a Category 3 at landfall, but it was moving a lot quicker. And the reason why that's important is a quicker movement can sometimes mean not as much rainfall accumulation because it's moving way too fast for a lot of that rain to reach the ground and kind of settle in. But it can also allow for that storm to maintain its strength a little bit longer. My example I want to give y'all, especially if you lived in the Carolinas for decades, is Hurricane Hugo. Remember, Hugo was one of the only storms to impact the Carolinas in which it was really more of a wind event, and it caused widespread power outages. People did not have power for weeks versus a lot of rain, which is what most of our systems are. I can think even back to storms that have been here since I've been here, since 2021. We had Fred. We had Debbie, we had Isaias. We've had a lot of those storms that have produced really heavy rain, and even some of those isolated risks for tornadoes. And that's because of where the storm moves in. We often get the remnants. But when you don't get the remnants, when you get the actual hurricane, that can allow for a storm to stay stronger longer. Something else I also want to point out is while here in the North Carolina area, we're not going to see impacts from Milton other than some cloud cover, which we already had streaming in today. What we are going to see near the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, so not just Florida, are elevated risks for rip currents and even some surge on the opposite side of Florida. And that's because, again, the storm is moving so quickly. We eventually will have that rotation bring in some of that surge on not just the east side of Florida, but also in South Carolina and Georgia. And so I'm going to back this up here for just 1 second so I can show you guys again. This is not just western portions of Florida that are under currently this hurricane warning. Notice it's literally the entire portion of the middle part of the state. It's Gainesville, Florida, where the University of Florida is. That's North Florida. And it's all the way toward the East Coast near St. Augustine and Jacksonville. So this is a substantial storm that we do have to keep a very close eye on. Still expecting, of course, the worst surge to be exactly where the storm made landfall, that Sarasota down south towards Charlotte County. Right now, about 9 to 13 feet of surge expected in those areas. That is similar in some spots to what they had with Hurricane Ian back in 2022. But with Hurricane Ian, the highest surge was actually recorded at about 18 feet, and that was on Fort Myers Beach. So that's one of the barrier islands of Lee County. At least based on where the storm made landfall, I do think that Lee County and down toward Collier County will see lesser impacts, but still upwards of 12 feet possible for Lee County. That includes Fort Myers, that includes Cape Coral, that includes Bonita Springs, and then you get a little bit further down south toward Naples, Everglades City, and that could be upwards of 9 feet. So it's hard to really quantify when people ask, well, could it be worse than X storm? Because it really depends on the storm. Brad and I even talked about this a little bit when it came to Helene here in the Carolinas, is that you never want multiple storms. But the one thing that you can count on when you have multiple storms to reference is that if, for example, I was talking about Milton, in this case I'm not, but let's say I was talking about 18 feet of storm surge. For people that lived on Fort Myers Beach and experienced that 18 feet 2 years ago, they have something to compare it to, even if they know the storm isn't exactly the same. But for the state of Florida, there's a lot more storms to compare versus here in inland parts of North Carolina, which is why we really didn't have much to compare with Helene, except for 1916's devastating flooding, which most people were not alive when that happened, that are still alive now. Now, the storm surge, like I mentioned, will be impacting the other side of the state as well, from really Jacksonville really all the way down toward Melbourne, which is just east of Orlando. So Daytona Beach, Melbourne. Melbourne is where the Kennedy Space Center is, just for a reference point. All of those areas could see up to 6 feet of surge on the back side of Milton, again, because the storm is moving so quickly. And then on the southern side of that, from Melbourne down south to really just north of West Palm Beach, those areas could see 1 to 3 feet. And actually the 1 to 3 feet will be shifting all the way up towards Savannah, Charleston, Tybee Island, also coastal spots of South Carolina and Georgia. But because of that same strong cold front that rolled through the area a few days ago, coupled with another really strong trough of low pressure here in the local portion of the Carolinas and Charlotte, we're not going to see much from this system. And again, I mentioned this a few days ago on air, but while that is good news for us, good news for those still recovering from Helene, you never want a devastating hurricane going anywhere else really in the world, but especially somewhere else in the United States. So here's kind of a Futurecast idea of what's going to happen with Helene, or excuse me, with Milton. Again, the storm made landfall already just about 15 or so minutes ago, around 8:30 near Siesta Key. We're going to see the storm continue to move inland. Again, on the back side of the rotation, areas in Lee County, even southern Charlotte County, will be impacted likely by that southern eye wall. So I worked at Wink News in Fort Myers for about 3 years. If any of you are watching this from your live stream on social media, wherever, and you are noticing that the storm has moved inland and you think you're kind of free and good to go, please do not go outside until you are told that it is safe to do so. Because when that northern eye wall wraps around and eventually turns further south, you will likely be impacted by some of those strong winds. While they may not be as strong as what's impacting Tampa right now, because of course Milton will weaken over land, they're still going to be substantially strong and still of hurricane force. So please, at this point, it's getting close to 9 o'clock. Let's just stay in our homes, stay safe, unless there's an emergency, of course, until morning time comes. As the storm quickly moves across the state, of course, there will be a lot of heavy rain. Orlando, Daytona Beach, Tampa, Lakeland, all the way toward the coast. I do think that Milton looks to reemerge around 5 or 6 a.m. back into the western Atlantic. It will likely still be a Category 1 hurricane when it first moves into the West Atlantic, but then we're going to see a lot of dry air, a lot of high wind shear help rip the storm apart. So it'll quickly go from hurricane status, eventually tropical storm, and as it continues to pull away over the next few days, it will likely weaken into a tropical depression. So what does this mean for folks, again, in coastal portions of the Carolinas? Storm surge, yes, from Charleston south. No impact in North Carolina other than a high rip current risk for a few days near the coastline, but we can handle that. And then for Georgia, parts of Savannah, Tybee Island, really down toward the Florida border, you're also going to see that impact from storm surge. We saw some clouds today. If clouds are all we get, we're okay with that. Where I do think that the problem continues to really be something not as much talked about is coastal portions of the area are impacted by storm surge. Okay, this is timed for some weird reasons. I'm going to back it up for a second. So storm surge mostly impacts folks near the coast. We know that. We talked about that so many times. But it's not just storm surge. It's also inland flooding and freshwater flooding and lakes, streams, rivers. Again, we've seen this in the Carolinas. Really heavy rain, upwards of about 16 inches on top of what folks already saw because of the fact that the Florida area did see a predecessor rain event. They saw rain days and days in advance of Milton actually moving through. So at least for the rest of today and into early tomorrow morning, it does look like the worst rainfall potential will be from Tampa, again, all the way into inland portions of Lake County, near Leesburg, Lady Lake, the Villages, Tampa, Lakeland, Orlando, Spring Hill, Tarpon Springs. You can see all of these areas included. Bay Lake, that's just to the south and west of Leesburg. That's right around the Villages area. Daytona Beach, Deltona, including both airports, of course, MCO, as well as SFB, which I believe is the code there for the second Orlando Sanford Airport. So Sanford, one of those areas. You can see Titusville, again, this really northern tip here of this barrier island just southeast of Titusville. That's Melbourne, where the Kennedy Space Center is. And again, you can see Daytona Beach all the way up toward Palm Coast, where if you're familiar with the northeastern coast of Florida at all, Palm Coast is just south of St. Augustine. So then we have Ocala, Palatka, all the way up toward eastern portions of Palm Coast, closer to St. Augustine. Again, still dealing with a high risk of significant flooding. And then you have Gainesville, where the University of Florida is. If anybody knows about me, I did go to school there. And again, we have Gainesville up toward Jacksonville that's still seeing a medium risk. So that's today. As we shift the focus here tomorrow, what I do want to point out here about these maps is technically this map goes until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. They're based on 24-hour periods. So the 12Z, which is 8 o'clock, that's UTC time, which we use in meteorology, goes pretty much from 8 a.m. to 8 a.m. So this will be a risk all the way toward Daytona Beach. You see the extreme risk all the way through 8 o'clock tomorrow. Then once we pass 8 o'clock, we'll shift a little bit more so toward the eastern coast of Florida, again from Melbourne to Orlando to Daytona, and then eventually that risk will shift offshore by Friday. So I've seen a lot of comments around, of course, again, since my parents live there, I've seen a lot of their friends asking things like that, if it's safe to drive tomorrow. I love all of you guys, of course, and so I would prefer if the answer is no. Let's try to hold off on any unnecessary driving till at least Friday, just because of the fact that there will be trees down, there will be power lines down, there will probably be gas stations with issues. I remember my first hurricane professionally, which was Hurricane Matthew, which actually just had the 8-year anniversary of yesterday, I believe, and can cause significant damage, even if the storm skirts the coast, even if the storm barely makes landfall. So that's just something to keep in mind as we get closer and closer to tomorrow and then eventually Friday. Another thing I want to point out too is there's been a substantial amount of severe weather that's happened with Milton as the storm has continued to move inland. We had multiple reports of confirmed tornadoes across parts of Lee County and Fort Myers and Cape Coral. In fact, my significant other's uncle, so I guess my uncle-in-law, sent some pictures actually from a confirmed tornado that was in North Fort Myers. And so again, some of these areas, Cape Coral, Fort Myers, over on the west coast of Florida, because of the fact that they were on the northeast quadrant. Keep in mind that a storm's movement is where the northeast quadrant is. So if the storm is moving in like this, and that's essentially where the storm made landfall, well, I guess it's a little bit too south. Let's redraw this. Okay, so if this is the storm's movement, where's the northeast quadrant? Well, it's this entire side and actually all the way down toward parts of Miami. So it's really all of this mess. If this is the storm angle of approach, it's pretty much everything here. And so that's where we see the most spin, the highest risk of tropical tornadoes. Multiple reports of that today. These are storm reports just from the last 24 hours. You saw the 3 in parts there of Lee County. You can see 2 near Placid Lakes. That's inland toward parts of Hendry County, just near Lake O. We have Sebring over toward Okeechobee. Again, both of those. Can't talk today. Also near Lake O, we have parts of West Palm Beach up toward Port St. Lucie, Palm City, Fort Pierce, all of these reported tornadoes. Now, some of these reports could be from the same tornado that was confirmed, but again, it is something that we have to obviously keep a very close mind on. For folks maybe potentially just joining us here on our stream, we are confirming that Milton has made landfall as of 8:30 near Siesta Key. So that's in Sarasota County. It's essentially just directly west of downtown Sarasota. I don't know if we're getting any questions or anything like that. So if we do get any later on, I will be sure to answer any of them as best of my ability as I can later on. But what we do know is that we have multiple, of course, reports of confirmed tornadoes, a lot of significant wind, a lot of significant storm surge. We will likely continue to see some of these lower end hurricane force winds in Tampa, Sarasota, tropical storm force winds in Fort Myers overnight heading into very early tomorrow morning. Notice eventually once that center moves back over the open ocean, we will start to see some of those winds die down very quickly. Here in the Carolinas and northern portions of the Carolinas, we will see some winds becoming breezy at times for tomorrow morning, but again, nothing like what folks in Florida are dealing with right now. I'm going to take it back to our satellite and radar product so I can see if there have been any updates from the National Hurricane Center that we can, of course, bring you live here on our stream. So I saw this update, 8:30, of course. Dangerous Hurricane 3 Milton making landfall, life-threatening storm surge, extreme winds, flash flooding. We knew all of those things. Doppler radar indicated we had a sustained wind and a gust of 97 miles per hour in Venice. That is in southern parts of Sarasota County, so pretty much between Sarasota and Port Charlotte. Also did have a weather flow station recording 67 miles per hour sustained and a gust of 83. That was on the Skyway Fishing Pier. That is further off the coast, but near Sarasota and Charlotte County. And again, another gust of 73 miles per hour recently reported at Sarasota Bradenton International Airport. If you're familiar with this area, Sarasota is a little bit further south of Bradenton, and really Sarasota Bradenton is in Manatee County, right on the edge between those two cities. So it's a little bit further north than where the storm made landfall, because Siesta Key is a little bit further south and west of Sarasota, but again, still very, very close. The storm again was still at 120 miles per hour when it made landfall, and as of right now, it's about 115 miles away from Orlando. So it is moving very quickly. It is continuing to produce significant wind, significant storm surge. And at this point, really the biggest thing we can say is just significant prayers and thoughts for our neighbors down toward our south. I'm trying to see if there's any other updates that I can provide you guys before we get off of this stream. That really looks like it for now. Of course, we've talked a lot about the fact that we'll see really strong winds, even further inland, even areas inland toward Orlando. And again, the Villages, Lady Lake, Leesburg, Lakeland, all the way toward Melbourne, Orlando, near the immediate coast, in Daytona Beach, we'll see winds potentially gusting near about 80 to 100 miles per hour. So it is still Category 2 peak intensity as that storm continues to move through the area. I also want to briefly talk about the fact that predecessor rain events, which I did a weather IQ on this today, sometimes will cause a phenomenon called the brown ocean effect. What happens is that there's so much rain, and that rain is so tropical, so it's so warm that sometimes that helps a storm maintain strength even as it moves inland. We saw a little bit of that with Helene because, again, the ocean waters were so warm, and that was an important thing that we were looking at with Milton, because the ocean waters typically, when they're right around their normal temperature, so 80 to about 83 miles per hour, or degrees Fahrenheit, when a storm moves over the open ocean, we have upwelling. So that's the cold air coming from underneath and pulling back up to the top. Well, what happened with Helene is that the ocean water temperatures were so warm, they were actually in the upper 80s to near 90, that the upwelling really only brought those temperatures in the water back down to normal. So they were hovering right around 80 degrees. So there really wasn't a lot of upwelling from Helene that would allow for Milton to then start to weaken or become a little bit weaker before landfall. Really the only thing that saved areas here from being worsely impacted is the fact that there was some wind shear in that area. And remember, wind shear helps rip a hurricane apart, whereas tornadoes and other severe weather, they like wind shear because that's winds changing with direction and height. With wind shear, remember, hurricanes and tropical storms are essentially flat, and so it kind of shears them off, rips them apart at the top. So as the storm moves over land, yes, it will likely weaken, probably a Category 2, if not a high-end Category 1 as it moves through central Florida. Still going to be packing a punch with wind, storm surge on the backside as it reemerges back into the open ocean, as it is still very warm there. But as it tries to move further northeast, as it gets closer to coastal Georgia and coastal South Carolina, we know that that same trough of low pressure will help push it away, and there is some stronger wind shear when it reemerges back into the open ocean, back into the western Atlantic, that will help it weaken a little bit too. So even if it reemerges tomorrow morning and causes some of those backside winds, I would expect that to diminish relatively quickly. Just wanted to give you an update. Again, we've been on for about 20 minutes or so, so I'll wrap this up quickly so people can get back to their evenings. If you've been watching, staying weather aware, please, thank you so much for doing so. If you have friends or family in Florida and any of these areas impacted, my thoughts and prayers are with you and with them. Of course, as always, we say in the Carolinas, we will get through this, not just as a state, of course, or two states, I guess, but as a country as well. And I was very encouraged to hear from the FEMA director earlier. We had this in the shows that people in North Carolina were made aware that they would not lose out on any kind of funding, any kind of, positive impact from FEMA due to, of course, the storm in Florida. So they were going to be able to separate that and make sure that us in North Carolina, we're still going to get plenty of those resources that we continuously need. Thank you so much for watching the stream. If you have any questions, comments, concerns that you would like me to answer, I will do my best to do so. Later on in the newscast, we will have live coverage on Milton, of course, as the storm has officially made landfall in Florida near Siesta Key. We will have that coming up tonight at 11 o'clock right here on WCNC Charlotte. And as always, all of our newscasts, all of our updates will stream on WCNC Plus, as well as on the WCNC Charlotte mobile app. Thank you so much again for watching. Please stay safe and stay weather aware. And I can leave you with the fact that we have no tropical impacts from anything here in North Carolina over the next 7 days. Have a safe and great night, and I'll see you a little bit later.